Hello everybody, this is Yasmeen from Yarkspiri fantasyart.com. Today I decided to change it up a little bit, so you'll see a little bit more of my pre-work, so my sketching, overall design, and how I actually work with layers in this video. So to begin, I do a sketch, a preliminary sketch to figure out my pose and the general structure of the character as well as the background idea. Now, for me, figuring out the pose is the most difficult portion, so I do spend the most time on that portion to make sure it is correct. And at first, with this character, as you can currently see, I actually work pretty small so that I can always, because it is a rough sketch, I don't need a high amount of detail for this sketch. So I just blow it up and reposition the character once I'm satisfied with the initial pose. Something I also do fairly often in this stage is I do tend to use the warp tool, and you can get that warp tool simply if you have the selection tool at hand. You can actually just right click it and choose transform, and then from there you can actually just choose the warp tool. It is a very useful tool. But you do have to be careful in how you use it, because there is a couple of different ways of using it. You can just select a certain portion of the body and manipulate that one portion of the body at a time, or you could select the whole character, and depending on what you're trying to do or the changes you're trying to make, it can be more beneficial to do one over the other. Another tool that's very similar to this is the liquefy tool. Once again, it's a very useful tool, and I do use it fairly often. It's just to work out normally the initial sketch that I'll use it, though. Because once I start painting, I don't want to have to deal with structural problems, so I do try to figure out as much as possible through my initial sketch for the character. Now, I did go through, you saw me go through a couple of different layout designs. I did decide that the character looked more like he was actually taking something from somewhere. So because of that, I was like, well, I haven't drawn a necromancer yet, so I could have him actually drawing out the souls from the dead. And if he's drawing out the souls, maybe that is actually what makes up part of his cape. It's that energy that he draws from them. So I went with that idea. And from that idea, I got some pretty interesting results too. As you can see, I did some changes on the leg structure. I wasn't happy with it, with the pose overall. I do look at myself in the mirror when I have a fairly large mirror that I keep next to me, so I do look at myself in the mirror to figure out if the pose is correct. I also do have quite a few reference books. I actually use the Virtual Pose series to figure out whether or not I would see certain muscles and whether or not the anatomy is correct of my character as well. So by flipping through those pages, I can normally figure out, okay, that pose doesn't read, I can't physically do this pose, so there's something wrong, I have to change it. So I didn't like the way the initial pose was, so I changed it. Now in this case, you could see me blocking out the major colors that I'm going to use for the character. I'm using the eyedrop tool, but I actually have the brush selected. But in order to change between the brush and the eyedrop tool, as long as you have the brush actually selected, you can actually just hold down the Alt key, and that actually lets you sample the brush or the colors that are actually on your palette. That does tend to work best if you're going to color them in at full opacity, though. If you ever see that circle that keeps on appearing every so often, that's actually because I am using the sample brush. I'm not sure why, but Cam Studio seems to cause that effect when I'm running Cam Studio and Photoshop at the same time. So it's a little glitch, but I've been able to edit most of it out so you won't see it too often. But yeah, using the Alt key does save a lot of time, and it also helps ensure that I'm using the same colors or very similar colors throughout the piece. Now when you use that the eyedrop tool, you will notice that because you actually have a background, it does affect the color slightly. So you won't get the color 100% every time because of this. The only way to get the exact same color is to save it as a separate color within your palette and sample your colors through the palette instead. The only problem with that is if you're trying to add a gradient slowly into a character and you're using you can't sample all those colors within your palette just because it's too many colors to keep track of. It's just simpler to sample from the character itself that you've already created. So that's why you see me keeping a fairly simple palette, is because I don't require as many colors because I do sample from the character as I go. Now this is following a very similar process to what you see me do in the past videos. Once again, I'm just making sure that the anatomy of the character reads correctly after I've actually blocked in some of the major colors. And once I've finished one arm, I will often sample those exact same colors into the next arm. Now this drawing didn't take too long to do. It only took about 5 hours. The reason why it didn't take too long either is because I kept the background fairly simple in the end. In this case, I was actually trying to work on getting the colors to flow better, and to also avoid adding too many dark colors to the character, because I did want to experiment a little bit to see how much shadows I could achieve just by using some of my existing colors that I have in my palette. A lot of the techniques that I used in this piece is something that I use on a fairly regular basis, but how you apply those techniques in your piece does make a big difference. So every so often I'll try to experiment with my technique in general and to figure out, oh, okay, is there a better way of doing this? By doing that, it keeps it more interesting for me as an artist, but it also lets me learn too, because there's always something new to learn when you're drawing. Now there is quite a few parts of or portions of the body of this character that you won't actually see because it's hidden by clothes. I did paint over extra areas just to make sure that you wouldn't see any of the background through the clothes. That is important to do, and even though the character is being hidden by his clothes, I did figure out the full structure too, once again. The clothes wrap around the character itself, it's not the reverse. Okay, now because of time constraints, and because Cam Studio actually did not save all my files correctly, some of them did get corrupted, I'm going to show you some of the layers that I have in my final piece. As you can see, the character itself, the shadows and all that, they're one piece. The armor, though, and the clothes are a separate piece from the character. What this allows me to do is I can select all those areas and color them in separately from the actual character. So if I have to do changes, it makes it a lot easier. If I'm trying to add additional colors within the character, once again, it makes it a lot easier to do. So these are the two basic layers that I currently have for this character. So there's no background, there's no effects added yet. These are the main layers that I normally start off with. Now from there I have to start working out the background, because a lot of how the character interacts with the background is dependent on the color palette as well of the background. So this is the first stage of adding basic shapes and colors to the background so that I can start bringing those colors into the character itself. As you can see, I didn't use anything fancy. I just used the basic soft brush that comes with Photoshop to do this. And from that, I just put some really simple colors to figure out, okay, this is the color palette I'm going with. I might have to make some changes to the character's color palette now that I have this background color palette. So in the next stage, I actually add a couple more details, and I've also added some more additional colors into the background as well. They're not too different from the initial color palette. It's still all very rough. I'm trying to keep the focus on the character as well at this point. Now I've started adding some light effects to this. The reason why I start adding it in at this stage is because how the light is actually being brought into the scene will affect how the character is lit. I already had a rough idea how I was going to light the scene, but by adding these right now, I can actually solidify that and add proper contrast to the characters and add a couple of additional colors as well to help draw the viewer's eye towards specific areas too. Okay, so I've started adding the shadow. This shadow, I keep this on a separate layer in case I have to do changes. Normally I don't need to do any changes once it's done. But this helps ground the character within the piece. Without the shadow, the cast shadow of the character, he doesn't look part of the environment at all. So it is very important to add that cast shadow to help ground his feet into this environment. Now the next stage is where I've actually added some of the colors that you currently see for in the light area and the general colors in general. So as you can see, I had a couple of different reds within it and some yellow light. So I added both of those colors within the character to help reinforce the idea that he's part of this environment. If you look back at the previous one, he didn't have that, so he was popping out too much. That occurs when you don't have the same light source, or he's not being lit properly within the scene. So in order to solidify the fact that he belongs in the scene, I had to light him accordingly. Okay, so in this layer, I've actually added the details, which actually help support the fact that he's a necromancer. So he's actually absorbing the energy of the dead, and he's using that. And it's actually giving him more power, and his cape is actually part of this. So it's either a tool that he uses to help control the dead, or it's an extension of himself. And I've also added, if you look at his boots and the rest of his armor, I've actually added the same type of colors that you see in his highlights of his actual body as well. Once again, that helps solidify that he belongs into the scene. Okay, and in the next stage, I'm actually adding a bit more details, a bit more colors within the energy that's coming through him and the skulls. I'm also adding some details into the background to make sure that they are correct. Give them some cast shadows to make sure that they look like they're part of this environment as well. Okay, and in the final image, I've actually added more additional details onto the grass to make sure it looks like grass, because initially it didn't look like grass. It also helps emphasize the mood of this character or this scene. So these are just a couple of layers that I use in my pieces. Now there is more layers, but normally what I'll do is I'll combine these layers at the last moment just to make sure that it reduces my overall file size, because if the file size is too large, it gets really difficult to use. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I thought it was a good idea to change it up a bit because you guys might be getting a little bit bored with my other videos. So let me know if you like this. I'll do more like this, obviously. But I need to know from you guys what it is that you guys like to see in these video tutorials. Because if you post a comment, I normally look at the comments. I do try to read as many as I can. Obviously, most of my videos don't have too many comments yet, so it's easier for me to follow. But I do check it on a regular basis. So if there's something you want to see, something you're trying to learn, let me know, and I'll definitely try to include it in my next video. Alright? So this is DK from mineral.com. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you soon. Thank you, and take care.